Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. Elliot Carter was the kind of man who could have anything he wanted. The skyscraper that housed his office was his sanctuary, towering over the busy streets below like a monument to his success. He owned a multi-million-dollar business empire, had luxury cars lining his driveway, and lived in a penthouse overlooking the city. People respected him, envied him. To the outside world, he was a man who had everything figured out. But there was something missing. He didn't need much, only that which solidified his place at the top of the food chain: power, control, respect. The day began like any other. The office was a flurry of activity, with his assistants buzzing around, attending to various meetings, phone calls, and arrangements. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air as Elliot flipped through the stack of papers on his desk, eyes narrowing at each one. He was reviewing a contract when he heard the faint sound of the doorbell. "Elliot, the delivery's here," his secretary called from the doorway. "The package you've been waiting for." Elliot glanced at his watch. Late as usual, he thought with a roll of his eyes. It had been over an hour since the agreed time. That was typical for people who didn't have their lives together. Unreliable, unorganized. He didn't have time for inefficiency. He put the paper aside and stood up, straightening his suit as he walked toward the door. Standing in front of him was a young woman. Her unkempt hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her simple attire, a faded jacket and worn-out jeans, spoke volumes about the life she led. She was holding a small package in her hands, the kind of delivery that didn't seem to match the grandeur of his office. Elliot barely looked up at her as he took the package. His eyes scanned the receipt she handed him, dismissing her presence entirely. He didn't have time to waste on people like her. "Here's the receipt," she said, her voice steady, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of confidence in her tone. He glanced up, not really paying attention, but the calmness in her voice made him pause for a split second. "Thanks," he muttered, preparing to close the door and get back to work. But the young woman didn't move. She stood there, her eyes locked onto his, waiting. Something about her gaze made Elliot uncomfortable, and for a brief moment he felt as if she was assessing him. "Is there something else?" he asked, his patience thinning. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Time was money, and he didn't like it being wasted. "I noticed something," she said, her voice still calm but unwavering. "You've overpaid for your order." Elliot raised an eyebrow, his mind already dismissing her observation. He had dealt with thousands of transactions before, and he knew how these things worked. He was in charge of a multi-million-dollar business. People made mistakes all the time, but he always made sure to correct them quickly. But there was something in her tone that made him hesitate. "What do you mean?" he asked, his annoyance turning into curiosity. She was just a delivery girl. What could she possibly know about financial discrepancies? "There's an error on the invoice," she said, stepping forward slightly and pointing at the line item in question. "You were charged for expedited shipping, but the package wasn't sent with that service. It's a small mistake, but you're paying for something you didn't get." Elliot blinked. This wasn't a mistake he had expected. Most people wouldn't have noticed, let alone pointed it out. He had been on the other side of many such exchanges, and never once had anyone dared to challenge him over the fine print. He looked at her again, really looked at her this time. She wasn't just any delivery girl. She was composed, clear-headed, and had noticed a detail that even his assistants might have overlooked. But why would she care about a trivial amount of money in a world where she had so little? There was something deeper here. For a moment, he felt a flicker of admiration, but quickly pushed it aside. She was a delivery girl, after all. He was a millionaire. She didn't belong in his world. "I'm sure it's a simple mistake," he said, trying to brush off the interaction. But instead of backing away, she took another step forward. She wasn't intimidated. "You can call the company," she said, "but if you want the full refund, you'll need to file a complaint." Her gaze never wavered. "That'll take some time, though." Elliot was intrigued now. "She's no ordinary delivery girl," he thought. There was a sharpness in her eyes, something that hinted at intelligence beyond her station. He'd met countless people over the years, and while many of them were rich, educated, and successful, few had this level of awareness. Most people like her, people from her background, didn't speak this way. They didn't challenge the wealthy, the powerful, but she did. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. His curiosity was getting the better of him. Her eyes softened for a brief moment, and for the first time she seemed almost human. "Because sometimes people don't see the small things, and those small things add up." Elliot raised an eyebrow. What is she talking about? It was just a delivery, after all. Just a minor financial mistake. But her words lingered in the back of his mind, like an itch he couldn't scratch. He didn't know why, but he found himself asking, "What do you do exactly, besides delivering packages?" She smiled faintly, and there was a hint of something mysterious in her expression. "You'd be surprised how much I've learned just by watching people like you." There it was, the crack in the facade. Elliot had been too quick to judge her. He had assumed she was just another cog in the machine, another person who had no choice but to work for the scraps she was given. But what if she was more than that? Before he could respond, she turned to leave. "I'll leave the refund form on your desk," she said. And with that, she walked out of his office, leaving him standing there, staring after her, his thoughts racing suspense and mystery. What was she hiding? Was she really just a delivery girl? And how did she know so much? Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than he had initially believed. As the door clicked shut behind her, Elliot stood still, staring at the empty space where she had just been. His mind was in turmoil. He had met countless people in his life, but no one had ever affected him quite like this woman had in such a short time. There was something about her, something that didn't add up. Elliot Carter couldn't concentrate. The morning passed by in a blur, and the contract he had been reviewing lay forgotten on his desk. His mind kept drifting back to the woman, no, the girl, who had come to deliver his package. Her calm demeanor, the way she had pointed out the mistake in the invoice, the unsettling confidence in her voice, none of it made sense. It wasn't just the way she'd spoken, it was the way she saw. Elliot was used to being the one who noticed every detail. He had built his empire on that very trait, but with her it was different. She didn't just notice the details, she understood them, and it was as if she had caught him slipping, and he wasn't used to that feeling. The minutes ticked away, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. What did she mean when she said, "People like you don't see the small things"? Was it just a remark about the small error on the invoice? Or was she implying something deeper, something more personal? His phone buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a call from his business partner, Liam. "Elliot," Liam's voice crackled through the speaker, "we need to talk. There's a problem with the merger. I've been looking at the numbers again, and there's something you need to see." Elliot sighed. Another crisis to manage. He stood up from his desk and walked toward the window, the bright sunlight casting long shadows across the room. The view from his office was spectacular, but today it felt distant, disconnected from the nagging thoughts that had taken root in his mind. His life was built on control, but today it felt like that control was slipping through his fingers. "Elliot?" Liam's voice broke through the silence. "Yeah, I'm here," Elliot muttered, trying to refocus. "Send me the details. I'll look it over after the meeting." The call ended, but Elliot didn't hang up. His eyes wandered to the corner of the office, where the delivery package still sat unopened. He had meant to look at it earlier, but somehow he couldn't bring himself to do it. Something about the whole situation seemed wrong. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his assistant, Marissa, holding a stack of papers in her hands. She stepped into the office and placed the papers on his desk. "Mr. Carter, we've got a meeting with the potential investors at 3 o'clock. You might want to prepare," she said, her voice a little too formal. Elliot nodded absently. Yeah, I'll be there." Marissa hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the package in the corner. "Is everything all right? You look distracted." Elliot gave a half-hearted smile. "I'm fine, just a lot on my plate today." She didn't press further, but gave him a questioning look before walking out of the office. Elliot's mind kept returning to that woman, the delivery girl. What was her story? What was behind those quiet eyes and that knowing smile? A loud chime echoed from his phone, reminding him of the meeting. He stood up, trying to push the thoughts of the girl from his mind. As he gathered his papers, he caught a glimpse of her business card lying on the edge of his desk. He had almost forgotten that she had left it with him when she handed over the package. His fingers brushed against the card, and he stopped for a moment. Claire Foster, legal consultant. Legal consultant. Elliot blinked. A delivery girl turned legal consultant. His curiosity flared once again. Why had she been working as a delivery girl if she had such qualifications? And why hadn't she mentioned it during their interaction? It didn't make sense. She didn't look like a consultant. She didn't act like one either. But her sharp mind, the way she caught that tiny mistake on the invoice, had been no accident. The meeting with the investors passed in a haze. Elliot couldn't focus on the figures and projections in front of him. Every time he glanced at the screen or listened to the discussion, his mind drifted back to Claire. He kept wondering about her. Her silence, the way she had looked at him with no fear, almost as if she had been judging him. By the time the meeting was over, the sun was dipping below the horizon. Elliot stood up, his mind still reeling from the interactions of the day. He didn't want to go home. He didn't want to face another empty evening in his penthouse. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and made his way out of the office. It wasn't long before Elliot found himself outside the address Claire had written down on her business card. The city's streets were bustling with life as he walked through. The busy neighborhood, passing street vendors, parked cars, and pedestrians hurrying along. It was a far cry from the polished, high-end area where Elliot usually operated. The streets here were littered with a sense of struggle, with people who didn't have the same privileges he did. He stood in front of a modest building, nothing like the high-rise offices he was used to. There was no gleaming sign, no luxurious features. The door was unmarked, the windows small and unassuming, but as he stared at it, he realized he couldn't just walk away. He had to know more. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was simple, sparsely furnished with an air of quiet professionalism. Behind the counter, a woman sat typing away at a computer, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She looked up as Elliot entered, her eyes widening slightly, as if she wasn't used to seeing people like him here. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice neutral, though there was a curiosity in her gaze. "I'm looking for Claire Foster," Elliot said, his voice betraying no emotion. "She works here, right?" The woman nodded slowly. "She's in the back. I'll let her." "No, you're here." Elliot nodded in return, his thoughts racing. What was he even doing here? He had no reason to believe she would welcome him, someone like him, into her world. But the truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He wanted to understand her. He needed to know what had been behind that sharp, intelligent gaze. Why had she challenged him so effortlessly? A few moments later, Claire appeared, her usual composed self. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something else, something that Elliot couldn't place. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her tone still calm. But there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "I couldn't. Stop thinking about what you said earlier," Elliot admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "About the small things, about people like me." Claire raised an eyebrow, folding her arms across her chest. "And what exactly do you want to know?" Elliot hesitated for a moment. "I don't know. I guess I'm just curious. You're more than what you appear to be, aren't you?" She smiled faintly, as if she had been expecting this question all along. "I'm exactly who I appear to be. The rest is just something you choose to believe." He frowned, frustration building. "But you're not just a delivery girl. There's more to you." "I know it." Claire took a deep breath. "Let's just say, the world is full of surprises, Mr. Carter. Sometimes the people you least expect to challenge you are the ones who can change everything." Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something huge, something that would force him to confront everything he thought he knew, and he didn't know if he was ready for it. The evening air was colder than Elliot had anticipated as he stepped out of Claire's office, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click. He stood there for a moment, staring down at the street. Before him, lost in thought, Claire's words echoed in his mind. "Sometimes the people you least expect to challenge you are the ones who can change everything." What did that even mean? How could a delivery girl, now revealed as a legal consultant, have the power to change his entire world? She had already left an impression on him, but the more he thought about their conversation, the more questions arose. Elliot was used to having control over every aspect of his life. He commanded his empire with precision, each decision calculated to maximize profit and ensure success. But Claire had done something he hadn't prepared for. She had unsettled him. She had shown him a glimpse of something he had overlooked in his relentless pursuit of power, the deeper layers of humanity, the small things that often went unnoticed, yet held the power to alter the course of everything. As he walked back to his car, his mind raced. He needed answers. Claire was an enigma, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was something much larger at play here. She had spoken of the small things, and it struck him like a bolt of lightning. She wasn't just talking about the financial mistake with the delivery. She was talking about life. What had she meant? What was she trying to tell him? The next day, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to change. The day dragged on, filled with back-to-back meetings, phone calls, and endless paperwork, but his thoughts kept returning to Claire and their brief encounter. He found himself constantly looking at the clock, wondering when he would be able to see her again. It was late in the afternoon when he finally decided to take action. He had to know more, had to understand why she had challenged him, and what had motivated her to approach him in the way she did. The only way to find out was to meet with her again. He called his assistant, Marissa. "I need a car sent to my place, and make sure it's ready in the next 30 minutes. I have an errand to run." Marissa responded with her usual efficiency. "Of course, Mr. Carter. The car will be there shortly." Elliot hung up the phone and grabbed his jacket, heading for the elevator. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this go. He would confront Claire once more, not as a billionaire businessman, but as someone who needed answers. It didn't take long for him to arrive at her office again. This time, however, there was no hesitation in his step. He walked straight into the building, not bothering to glance at the street vendors or the disheveled storefronts. He had crossed a line when he stepped into this world yesterday, and today he was determined to find out what it meant. The same woman behind the counter greeted him with a slight nod, her expression neutral. "You're here for Claire, aren't you?" Elliot didn't answer, just nodded, following her lead as she walked to the back. He'd already made up his mind about this place. It was unassuming, almost too modest for someone like Claire. Yet, it was the perfect facade. It was so ordinary that it made no sense. Just like her, "Mr. Carter," Claire's voice called out before he could even reach the door. You're persistent. Elliot couldn't help but chuckle. I guess you could say that. Claire was sitting at her desk, her fingers resting lightly on a pile of legal documents. She didn't look up immediately. Her focus was on the papers in front of her, but she wasn't distracted. There was something deliberate in her calm demeanor, as though she knew exactly what was going through Elliot's mind. I didn't expect you to come back, she said, finally looking up and meeting his gaze. I thought our conversation yesterday was enough. Elliot stood in front of her desk, a mixture of frustration and curiosity bubbling inside him. I can't let it go, he said, his voice steady but firm. I don't understand why you did it. Why challenge me? You had to know I wouldn't just let this go. Claire sighed, pushing the papers aside. It's not that simple, Mr. Carter. Then explain it to me, Elliot demanded. Explain why you said that about the small things. You've caught my attention. Now tell me what this is really about. For a moment, Claire seemed to hesitate, as though weighing her words. She wasn't afraid, but there was a heaviness. In her eyes, a burden she had carried for far longer than Elliot had realized, and that burden was something he wanted to understand. You want to know why I challenged you? She asked, her voice soft but resolute. Because I've seen too many people like you, people who think they have it all, but they miss what really matters. They overlook the smallest things, and those things come back to haunt them. Elliot's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? You're saying that I'm missing something? Claire nodded slowly. Yes, you're so focused on the big picture that you're ignoring the details, the things that really matter. It's not just about business or wealth, it's about people, it's about humanity. Elliot was taken aback. What do you know about my life? About the sacrifices I've made to get here? You think it's all just about wealth? It's about control, power. Claire's expression remained unchanged, as though she had heard these words 1,000 times before. That's exactly it, she said quietly. You've spent your entire life chasing power, thinking it would fill the emptiness. But it never will. It never does. Elliot felt a pang of something. Doubt, maybe. Or a realization that he hadn't been expecting. And what do you think will fill the emptiness? He asked, his voice more vulnerable than he had intended. Claire didn't respond immediately. She studied him for a long moment, as though searching for something in his eyes. Then she spoke. You have to understand what it means to truly see people, not just with your eyes, but with your heart. The conversation shifted then. Elliot had come here expecting answers, but now he was questioning everything he had built. He had always thought he understood people. After all, he had built his empire by learning how to read people, how to predict their actions. But Claire's words struck a chord. For the first time in his life, he felt as though he was the one being read, the one who had been misunderstood. As the minutes passed, Elliot grew more and more uncomfortable, but he couldn't leave. The gravity of the conversation was pulling him in deeper, and he wasn't ready to walk away just yet. Why are you telling me this? He asked quietly. Why me? What's your angle? Claire met his gaze without flinching. Because I see something in you that you don't see in yourself. You're searching for something that's been right in front of you the entire time, and I can help you find it, but you have to trust me. Elliot's thoughts were a whirlwind. Trust. He had never trusted anyone. Never. He had learned long ago that trust was a dangerous game, especially when it came to people who had no power. But now, sitting in front of this woman who had challenged him, who had seen through his walls, he felt something stirring deep inside him. He wanted to trust her. He didn't know why, but he did. Elliot sat in the dimly lit office, staring at Claire across the desk. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant noises of the street outside were muffled, almost like a distant echo in his mind. He had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable than he did in this moment. Claire had challenged him in ways no one ever had before. Every word she spoke seemed to peel away at the layers of self-assuredness he had built over the years, revealing the cracks that had always existed but were buried under his unrelenting pursuit of success and control. "You're searching for something," Claire had said. "Something that's been right in front of you this entire time." Elliot couldn't shake those words from his mind. He had always been in control, always driven by the desire to build more, to conquer, to rise above the chaos of the world. But now, for the first time, he questioned if he had been chasing the wrong things. Was it all worth it? What was the point of having power and wealth if it didn't bring peace, if it didn't bring understanding? As Claire sat silently across from him, her presence calm and unyielding, Elliot felt the weight of her gaze on him. She wasn't just challenging him with words anymore, she was forcing him to confront himself, and that scared him more than anything else ever had. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Elliot shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the desk. His mind was racing, but he couldn't make sense of the thoughts that flooded his consciousness. What was he supposed to do with this newfound sense of unease? How could he reconcile the life he had built with the unsettling truth Claire was offering him? Claire finally spoke, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was an undeniable strength beneath it. "You know, Mr. Carter," she began, "you've spent your whole life building an empire, but you've never once stopped to ask yourself why. Not really." Elliot clenched his jaw. The question she posed was simple, yet it hit him like a punch to the gut. He had never truly asked himself why he wanted power. He had simply taken it year after year until it became his identity. But now, faced with the reality of Claire's words, he wondered if it had all been in vain. "I've always had a reason," he said, his voice tight. "I want to succeed. I want to prove myself, to build something that lasts." "And you've done that," Claire replied, her eyes never leaving his. "But what's it really worth? What does it mean to build something if it doesn't serve you in the way you truly need? What's the point of it all if you've lost yourself along the way?" Elliot felt a pang in his chest. The truth of her words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He had been so focused on success that he had neglected the very thing that could bring him fulfillment, his own humanity. The realization was jarring, like waking from a long, comfortable sleep, only to find that the world had changed while he wasn't paying attention. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain a lifetime of ambition and desire for power when he had no real answer for why he wanted it in the first place? Claire watched him with quiet intensity, her expression unreadable. She knew the weight of the question she had asked. She knew it would force him to confront something he wasn't ready to face. "You've always been surrounded by people who want something from you," Claire continued. "They admire your wealth, your success, but they don't know you. They don't see you, and you're so used to that you've convinced yourself it doesn't matter." Elliot stared at her, his mind a blur. How could she know so much about him without ever meeting him before? She was right, of course. He had always kept people at arm's length, always surrounded himself with sycophants who praised him for what he had, not who he was. He had built walls around himself, and over time, those walls had become a fortress. But what good was a fortress if no one could see inside? What good was success if it didn't mean anything? "That's the price of success," Elliot said quietly, as if trying to convince himself. "People see me as a business transaction. They don't see the man beneath the title." Claire shook her head. "That's the lie you've been living," she said, her voice firm now, almost as though she was speaking to a child. "You've been so focused on what you think you need, money, power, respect, that you've forgotten what it means to truly live, what it means to connect with others, to feel something real, not just the empty satisfaction of more. Her words stung, but Elliot couldn't deny them. He had built a life that appeared perfect from the outside. He had everything he could possibly need, except for the one thing that truly mattered: connection. Real, genuine connection with another human being. He ran a hand through his hair, the frustration bubbling inside him. He had spent so many years building this empire, and now he was standing here, on the edge of everything, and it all felt meaningless. "What do you want from me, Claire?" he asked, his voice rough. "What is it that you're trying to teach me? What do you expect me to do with all of this?" Claire leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady and piercing. "I'm not trying to teach you anything, Mr. Carter. I'm just trying to help you see what you've been blind to all these years. The things you've been ignoring, the people you've pushed away, are the very things that could set you free. You just have to choose to open your eyes." Elliot stared at her, searching for the words to express the overwhelming feelings inside him. The truth was, he wasn't sure he could change. He wasn't sure he could let go of the life he had built. It felt like a lifetime of decisions, actions, and sacrifices, all leading him to this moment. He had spent his whole life trying to control everything around him, but now, faced with Claire's words, he felt completely powerless. "I don't know if I can," he admitted quietly. "I've spent my whole life trying to be someone else. I've forgotten who I am underneath all of this." Claire smiled faintly, as if she had been expecting this answer all along. "That's the first step, Mr. Carter, admitting that you don't have all the answers. That's when the real work begins." Elliot looked at her, feeling a mix of fear and hope. He had always prided himself on having control, on knowing exactly who he was and what he wanted. But now, for the first time, he realized that the person he had become wasn't the person he wanted to be. And Claire, she was showing him a way out. "You have a choice, Elliot," she said, her voice softening. "You can keep living the life you've built, hiding behind the walls you've constructed, or you can tear those walls down and start living the life you were always meant to live. It's up to you." Elliot felt a surge of emotion: anger, frustration, confusion, and something else, something he hadn't felt in years. It was the raw, vulnerable feeling of being seen. He had always kept people at a distance, but Claire had seen him for who he truly was, and in that moment he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He was tired of hiding. He was tired of pretending. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "I don't know where to begin," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "but I know I can't keep living like this." Claire nodded, her expression softening. "That's all you need to start. The rest will come when you're ready to face it." The key following days passed in a blur. Elliot's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions. What Claire had said to him lingered in his mind, twisting and turning, growing louder with each passing hour. He couldn't escape it, the realization that he had spent most of his life chasing something hollow, something that wasn't even real: power, control, respect. These things had all seemed so important to him, but now they felt like nothing more than distractions from the life he truly wanted to live. He had always thought that wealth and influence were the keys to happiness. He had built his empire from the ground up, overcoming countless obstacles, silencing every voice of doubt, and climbing higher and higher on the ladder of success. But now, as he walked the familiar halls of his office, he couldn't help but feel disconnected from it all. The sleek marble floors, the polished steel, the shiny glass walls, they all felt so empty. His empire, once a symbol of his hard work and determination, now felt like a gilded cage. For the first time in his life, Elliot questioned whether the life he had built was the one he truly wanted. And more terrifyingly, he questioned whether he could ever walk away from it. It was late one evening when Elliot found himself standing in front of the window of his penthouse, staring out over the city. The lights below twinkled like stars, 1,000 lives playing out in the streets, each person with their own story, their own struggles. And in that moment, Elliot felt small. It had been a week since his last conversation with Claire, and every day had been a battle, fighting the urge to return to the life he knew, the life that had defined him for so long. He had spent his days buried in work, and his nights in restless silence, wondering if he could ever make the leap. Could he abandon the life that had given him everything and start over? Was it even possible? The doorbell rang, snapping him from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for a business meeting, too late for anything that didn't feel urgent. He crossed the room and opened the door, half expecting to see one of his assistants, or maybe a late delivery. But when he saw Claire standing there, her presence filling the doorway, his heart skipped a beat. "Claire," he asked, his voice thick with confusion, "what are you doing here?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped inside, her gaze never leaving his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a heaviness between them, a tension that neither could ignore. "I've been thinking about you, Elliot," Claire said finally, her voice steady but soft, as though choosing her words carefully. "And I thought you needed to hear something important." Elliot felt a surge of emotion rise in his chest. He had been waiting for this moment, though he hadn't realized it until now. Claire had pushed him to this point. She had forced him to confront the truth about himself, about the emptiness in his life that he had tried so desperately to fill with ambition. And now, standing before her, he realized that he was ready to hear whatever it was she had to say. "Go on," he said quietly, his voice betraying the vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "I know this isn't easy for you. I know you've spent your whole life building something, chasing something that felt like the only thing worth pursuing. But now it's time to ask yourself, what do you really want, Elliot? What do you need?" Her words hit him like a wave. What did he need? He had spent years building this empire, this life of opulence and success. He had everything anyone could ever want. But none of it had ever made him feel truly alive. None of it had ever brought him the peace or fulfillment he had longed for. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. What do I really want? He didn't have an answer, but deep inside, he felt the stirrings of something new, something that had been buried for so long under layers of ambition and fear. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I want anymore." Claire didn't seem surprised. She stepped closer, her hand gently touching his arm. "That's okay," she said softly. "The truth is you've spent so much time trying to be someone you thought you should be that you've forgotten who you truly are. The question isn't just what you want, Elliot. The question is who you want to be." Elliot's mind raced. Who did he want to be? Who was he really, underneath the polished exterior of success? He had never asked himself that question. He had never been allowed to. He had been so focused on the goal that he had forgotten what it meant to live. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it all. The choices he had made, the people he had hurt, the opportunities he had passed up in pursuit of something that no longer seemed important. "I can't do it," Elliot said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I can't walk away from all of this. Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, it's too much. I don't know how to give it up." Claire stood quietly watching him, her expression soft but determined. "I'm not asking you to give it all up, Elliot. I'm asking you to choose something different. You can still have your success. You can still make your mark in the world. But you need to decide what truly matters, what's worth keeping and what's worth letting go of." Elliot looked at her, his heart racing. He could feel the truth of her words deep inside him, but it was terrifying. The idea of walking away from everything he had known, everything that had defined him, felt like the ultimate betrayal. to himself, to everyone who had helped him build his empire. "What if I fail?" he whispered. "What if I don't know how to live any other way?" "You're not going to fail, Elliot," Claire said, her voice filled with certainty. "You're not alone in this. You don't have to figure it all out right now. You just need to start. Take the first step." For the first time in his life, Elliot felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into the unknown. He could feel the fear clawing at him, threatening to pull him back into the safety of the life he knew. But he also felt something else, something more powerful than fear: hope. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotion and decision-making. Elliot didn't have all the answers, and he certainly didn't have a clear path forward. But for the first time, he wasn't trying to control everything. He was allowing himself to feel, to question, and to search for meaning outside of the metrics of success he had once relied on. He met with a few trusted colleagues, and he made the first difficult decision. He started delegating more of his responsibilities to others. He didn't need to carry the weight of it all anymore. He didn't need to be the one who did everything. He also started seeking out more personal connections, people who could see him for who he truly was, not just as the man who owned a billion-dollar empire. It was awkward at first. He wasn't used to being vulnerable, to letting people see the parts of him he had always kept hidden, but it was liberating. And with each passing day, Elliot found that the emptiness he had been living with for so long began to fill, not with success or wealth, but with something deeper, something more meaningful. It was a few weeks later when Elliot received a call from Claire. She didn't need to say much. Her voice, calm and steady, was all he needed to hear. "I see it now," Elliot said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. "I see what you meant. I've started making changes, small ones, but they're real. I'm not the same man I was." Claire's voice softened, filled with approval. "I'm proud of you, Elliot, but remember, this is just the beginning. The journey isn't over. You have to keep making choices, keep choosing what's important." Elliot smiled, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. "I will. I'm ready for whatever comes next." The city had never looked the same to Elliot. The streets that once seemed like a labyrinth of opportunity now appeared as mere paths leading nowhere. The tall skyscrapers and neon lights, which once stood as symbols of his success, had transformed into walls he couldn't scale. But rather than feeling trapped, he now felt free. Free from the chains of his own expectations and the pressure to be someone he wasn't. It had been months since that night Claire had shown up at his penthouse. Since then, everything had changed. Elliot had started doing what he once thought was impossible. He had begun to let go, not of his empire, not entirely, but of the need for it to define him. He had started delegating responsibilities at work, trusting his colleagues to handle the intricacies of his business, while he focused on the deeper, more personal aspects of life. The change wasn't easy. He had lived his entire life in control, and stepping back, allowing others to take charge, felt unnatural at first. But the more he let go, the lighter he felt. He wasn't defined by his business. He was defined by his actions, his relationships, and his choices. Elliot sat at his desk, a cup of coffee in his hand, staring at the view that had once been so important to him. He'd always looked out at the city as if it were a battleground, each street and building a contest to be won. Now the view seemed to reflect something deeper within himself, still beautiful, but not something he needed to conquer, just something to witness. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Claire. "Are you coming to the event tonight? It's important." Elliot hesitated. The event was one of the biggest charity fundraisers in the city. Normally, it would have been a must-attend for someone like him. Someone who built his wealth on his public image, his ability to network, and his influence. But now, the idea of rubbing shoulders with the same people who had once been his world felt like a trap. Would he slip back into the old patterns? Was he truly ready to face these people on his own terms? He stared at the screen for a long moment, considering his response. Then he typed, "I'll be there." He wasn't the same man who had once craved the spotlight. But tonight he would go, not for the sake of impressing anyone, but to see it through Claire's eyes, to see how far he had come. Later that evening, Elliot found himself walking through the grand hall of the event. The chandeliers sparkled above him, casting soft light over the elegantly dressed crowd. He had always felt a sense of power in these moments, standing in the midst of the city's elite, knowing he was the one everyone wanted to be. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't playing the game. He wasn't trying to outshine anyone. Instead, he was just another face in the crowd. And for the first time, he felt okay with that. He spotted Claire across the room, her back straight and her presence commanding even in a simple black dress. She was talking to a group of guests, laughing softly, completely at ease in a world that Elliot had once found so suffocating. As he approached her, Claire's eyes flickered toward him, and a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She excused herself from the conversation and walked toward him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, her voice warm but teasing. Elliot smiled back. "I wasn't sure either, but I think I'm finally ready to face it, to face everything." Claire studied him for a moment as if weighing his words. "And how does it feel?" "Different," he said, his voice low, "but in a good way. I don't need to be the center of attention anymore. I don't need to prove myself to anyone." Claire nodded. "That's the first real step. I told you, it's not about letting go of everything. It's about finding balance, and you're starting to understand that." Elliot looked around at the room, noticing the familiar faces of businessmen and women who had once been his peers. He had always been one of them, always driven by the need for success, for validation. But now, as he looked at them, he saw something different. He didn't need their approval anymore. He didn't need anything from them. The evening wore on, and Elliot found himself talking to people without the weight of expectation hanging over his head. He didn't care if they thought he was wealthy or important. He cared about the conversations, the connections, and the meaning behind them. He spoke with an old colleague about the challenges of the business world, but there was no competitive edge in his words. He spoke with a young entrepreneur about the struggles of starting from scratch, offering advice not to gain influence, but to share knowledge. For the first time in his life, Elliot wasn't competing for attention. He was simply existing, in the moment, surrounded by people, not for what they could give him, but for the relationships they could build. It was freeing. As the event came to a close, Elliot found Claire once more. She was standing by the large windows, gazing out at the city lights. He walked over to her, his heart full in a way it hadn't been before. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I never would have been able to do this without you, without the push, the reminder to see things differently." Claire turned to him, her expression soft but proud. "I didn't do anything, Elliot. You made the choice. I just helped you see what was already there." He looked at her, a sense of gratitude overwhelming him. "You've changed my life, not just by showing me a different way, but by making me want to change. I couldn't have done this without that." Claire smiled, her eyes shining. "That's the real power, Elliot. Not in what you've built, but in what you've allowed yourself to become. You're free now, and that's all that matters." Elliot nodded, his chest swelling with emotion. It wasn't about the empire anymore. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about who he was, who he had become, and who he was still becoming. "I'm ready for the next chapter," he said, his voice steady. "And this time I'm doing it my way." Claire's smile widened. "I'm glad to hear it." Days turned into weeks, and Elliot continued to build a new life, a life that wasn't defined by his business or his past. He traveled to places he had once only dreamed of visiting. He spent time with people who mattered to him, forging genuine connections, not out of necessity, but because he truly wanted to. He began to focus on the things that brought him joy, and in doing so, he found himself more fulfilled than he had ever been in his life. And through it all, Claire remained by his side, not as a guide, but as a partner. They shared in the discovery of life beyond ambition, beyond success. They built something together, not of wealth or prestige, but of mutual respect and understanding. One afternoon, months after that pivotal charity event, Elliot stood in his office once again, looking out over the city. He had just signed an agreement to sell off a significant portion of his business, something he had never imagined doing. But it wasn't a step backward, it was a step forward. He had learned that wealth wasn't just about money. It was about the richness of experience, the depth of relationships, and the strength to change. As he walked away from the office for the last time, leaving behind the empire he had built, he felt lighter than he ever had. He wasn't walking away from success. He was walking toward something greater. Elliot's transformation reaches its final stage. He chooses to embrace a life beyond wealth and status, shifting his focus to meaningful connections, personal fulfillment, and self-discovery. His relationship with Claire evolves into a partnership built on respect, not based on ambition or necessity, but on genuine human connection. This marks the end of his journey from a man driven by power to one who understands the true meaning of success, living authentically with purpose and compassion. The end